Today we are joined by Professor Nadia Malan, who is a former professor at the University of Johannesburg. Now, Prof. Malan has had a very beautiful initiative in the agriculture space, and some of you may be aware of his Izindaba Zokudla project, which he's been running for over a decade now, and it has blew out to be this beautiful and highly successful initiative. But the reason why we have him here today is because he's written a book called Ngazonke, and he focuses on urban agriculture. And this is very much rooted on Izindaba Zokudla, which he started very many years ago. But in addition to that, he has written quite a number of books, or he has a number of publications, really. And if I may make a mention of some of the pieces that is published, I think I would just collectively group it and say he's published on the social welfare system in the country. He's written on agriculture, and he ties all these to human rights, because really when you talk about anything that has to do with people and food, it taps on the right to food. So I look forward to the conversation that I'll be having with you, Prof. Nadia, and welcome to BTH. Prof. Nadia, greetings to you.
Hi, thank you, Kinisani. It's an absolute great pleasure to be on your podcast. And thank you for doing so well. That's very important.
We're excited to have you on BTH. As you would know, I am in the space, the agriculture space, and I am particularly excited about this conversation that we are starting now. So I've got I think a soft question for you related to the book that you see behind my screen there. What inspired you to write Ngazonke? Do you have any experiences that would have led you to writing this book?
Yeah. I mean, basically right at the bottom, I wanted to put forward, that we need to support small and urban farmers in the right way. And I was just a bit frustrated because I don't think we actually look at this issue in the right way. And we often empower small and urban farmers in the normal way, but actually we need to specify and work out exactly what is it that they need, because they are small in a context of large enterprises that dominate the sector. And what strategy and what workaround could we develop in order to make them successful? But having said that, there's also the background of Izindaba Zokudla, which unfortunately had to come to an end when I left the University of Johannesburg. So, I started Izindaba Zokudla in 2013, and it was extremely successful. At the height of the events, I could attract almost 500 people every time. But, just the experience of hosting those events and interacting with many, many farmers and interacting with others who have solutions, I saw all this stuff in front of me. And I realized, someone must keep it all together, put it all together, enhance it, supercharge it. And that is what I really did. I saw these things getting lost in space. And this is a way to keep it together. Else we'll lose this opportunity. Yeah.
Lovely. And maybe for the benefit of the viewers and the listeners, can you elaborate on Izindaba Zokudla?
Yeah. I started in 2013 with my good friend and colleague Angus Campbell from Industrial Design. And in that first year, we put together a participatory technology development, a student learning project. And that was extremely successful. And I'm actually astounded, the successes just came, but, we never could get support. So in that first 4 months of this, we had 3 patent applications, which is actually quite extraordinary. And we managed to link development studies students, social science students with industrial design students. and we worked out a methodology for the design of technologies. So all three were quite notable, but the one done by Natalia Tofas was a food cooler that worked with evaporative cooling, no electricity required, and it could keep a head of cabbage fresh for 3 days or perhaps a bit longer without any electricity. So those kind of designs are possible, but yeah, we just couldn't get it together to continue with that. And what I did is I continued with Izindaba Zokudla. The technology actually moved to the master's level, and we had very good examples. The shredder, there were quite good examples, and also the Begin beehives, which is now available as a commercial product. But I wanted to embed the technology development in a public forum, because that would be important in the later dissemination and implementation of these things. So that public forum, which initiated the project, eventually became the Farmers School and Innovation Lab in 2014. And then it just eventually became Izindaba Zokudla. It continued up until COVID. During COVID, we went electronic. And then after COVID, we went back to physical events. But from then on, we streamed it. And all of this is still somewhere on Facebook. So you can take a look at that. There's quite a bit of material there. But, it was a great experience for me. But, there were many other things that we can maybe talk about later. Eventually, it became untenable. And the universities struggle to implement and to move from just student level stuff, which often doesn't help, to real world stuff. Sorry, but it's really difficult for universities to do that kind of thing. Yeah, but let's see what the future holds.
Yeah, maybe while you're on that point, Nadia, you were working with the Soweto community mainly. I'm still gonna stick on Izindaba Zokudla because I feel Izindaba Zokudla greatly shaped the writing of this book, right?
Oh, yes.
And in you doing that, beyond just postgraduate supervision and projects that you are alluding to, how did communities get involved and how did they get to benefit from the project? The second part of that question is you talk about universities not being able to translate academic work into practical work that is of benefit to society. But I suppose the question would then be, considering the fact that academic institutions are fundamentally designed to be knowledge brokers, who should be the duty bearer when it comes to ensuring that what is learned and designed within academic parameters is translated into people's lived experiences in communities?
If I could answer that latter question first, it has to be the researcher, the lecturer, professor involved, and they must take responsibility for making their knowledge available to the public. If the university cannot do it for whatever reason, then you still have a responsibility. And that is the greater responsibility that goes beyond, the corporate identity and benefit that the university will get. This is about humanity and science, and those are higher order responsibilities than the corporate identity of a particular university at a particular time. So that is what is necessary. So it is up to us to make these things available to the community. So what I did is, the one thing that really aggrieves me is this idea of having a register or database or to control access to the university. What I did with Izindaba Zokudla is to take pains in making it completely open access where anyone can come at any time without any obligations, without strings attached, without being necessarily enrolled into projects of other people. It was really important that we address the issue of small farmer and urban farmer development as an issue that has merits on its own, and to address that issue before we go and find other reasons to do it. And it could be laudable reasons like food security, whatever. But food security, for instance, is not so appropriate for farmers, because food security is controlled by income and not availability of food. So when we mix these things, it becomes a problem, because now the poor farmer who's struggling to just survive now has to achieve other aims that they might not have chosen. So for me, it was important to have open access to Izindaba Zokudla. That's why we streamed everything. In the beginning, I wrote reports so anyone can gain access to it, and to not control people, but to allow people the freedom to choose. And I think freedom should be the driver of social change, and not, necessarily programs or projects that are dreamed up in an office somewhere. So it was quite important to get that right. And I think that was one of the reasons why people enjoyed Izindaba, because they could go there for free, gain expert and excellent advice, get access to information. For a while, we had data available. It was just impossible to get it organized consistently. People could mingle amongst themselves and self-select who they want to work with. And I think that was important. If we want anything to succeed, it must stand on its own feet. And that was one of my drivers. Often we prop up things like cooperatives, and at the end we damage ourselves, because it now takes longer to undo the wrong things. I hope that helps. Thank you.
You mentioned something very important there. You talk about the issue of accessibility. What seems to be the problem based on your, I would say, 13-year experience up to now? It could be more than that, actually. Why is it that with the communities that you've worked with, what seems to be the problem when it comes to accessing food? Is it the availability that you allude to, or is it because there is no financial resource for them to access food?
Yeah, finance overshadows everything. Poverty overshadows everything. We have a well-developed both formal and informal systems, although that doesn't mean in particular areas it might be difficult to get food. I mean, we all know that people generally have to pay for at least 2 taxi fares to get to the shop and back. So those things count, and they make big difference, because it's about 40 Rand. You can buy a kilogram of vegetables, for 2 taxi trips, if that, that's a cheap trip. So, those things we need to note. Also, the development of retail. I live in the old part of Joburg, Norwood, where the shops are in the street and they all face the public. What has happened is we've got the world's best climate, but we put all our shops in a big building with a very expensive air conditioning machine. I don't know if that is the way we should do things. Can we not introduce variations into the patterns of urban settlement? And that is also important, because everything becomes the same. But once again, those who dominate fall hard. So if you now build all your food shops in malls, you're actually creating opportunities for others. And these others are urban farmers, and there are real opportunities. And I set them out in the book. I want to look at this thing in a positive way, because we will always get stuck in the negatives. But there are real opportunities urban farmers have to supply food to the communities. But to do that, we need to reorient how they produce, how they waste, how they sell, how they engage, how they do technology. And that is what the book's about. If we change those things, the game is a different game, and there are real opportunities that are lucrative, and people should seize them. And that's what I want to do with the book.
Maybe tied to that last point, Nadia, you indicate that urban agriculture, and I know very well that you exist in the urban spaces, or at least urban uh, Izindaba Zokudla was primarily rooted in your urban spaces. I think we qualify Soweto as an urban space. It can't be peri-urban, right?
No, it's definitely urban, although there's quite a lot of pigs and cows and goats and sheep like everywhere.
So you indicate you place emphasis on urban agriculture as more than food production, but you see it as uh, more of an enterprise development uh, practice. So why is this distinction particularly important? Why do you make this distinction in the book?
Yeah, I mean, you know what? We must conceptualize the growth of urban and small farmers in terms of the enterprise, the kinds of enterprises they can create. And I do that because an enterprise is able to accumulate value better than an NGO. And I don't think we should develop urban agriculture and small farmers as welfareist organizations. They should develop enterprises to accumulate value. And these are often symbolic values, but like, for instance, ownership over land that has been improved with, say, a deep trench. And I advocate for deep trenches. Sure, an NGO can also do that. But the NGO might miss the true value, because if you have a piece of land, you could sell it just for the value of the deep trenches, because it's quite a bit of work to do it. And once they're done, it's productive. So, to transfer that value and enable economic mobility, an enterprise is important because, it can hold value, it can be sold. The processes of accumulating value, like a list of customers, which is a very important aspect of an enterprise. It doesn't make sense in an NGO context, and I don't know what would motivate, what would drive an NGO to increase production and things like that. It's very difficult to pinpoint that. So whereas in an enterprise context, it's perhaps more important. And we are not playing games here. This is real. This is not about, like someone's got money and we can now start an NGO. No, this is real. People's lives are at stake. So for that farmer to be able to actually accumulate value and build a life and identity and some kind of wealth, we need to put it in the right house, the vehicle, and that vehicle would have to be an enterprise.
Interesting. But where do you think we're going wrong? I want to zoom into agencies and government. You do make a mention of fragmented support in the book. What do you think is amiss in this whole system?
Yeah, so I mean, the support from where I sit looks fragmented, but for government, it's unitary. And a lot of people have mentioned this. The state really kind of drives the commercial objective, and all farmers should become commercialized. So they're also an enterprise development approach. Yeah, I agree with them. But then it comes to the appropriateness of the production strategy. So what happens, and it's often deliberate choices, but it also happens by default, is we see one model for agricultural enterprise development, and that would be a commercial model. Tied to that commercial model is the technologies of the Green Revolution. And I'm actually astounded that, I mean, these things are appropriate to large, well-capitalized farmers. Sure, let them go. There are problems with that, and we need to change those systems. But we cannot generalize that model to everyone. As you go smaller, I mean, I taught many things. I also taught entrepreneurship. And the minute your enterprise becomes smaller, the way you engage with your supply chains and your input chains have to change, because in the background is the bulk purchase of these things and the prices, which are determined by bulk trade. So, for a smaller farmer, those prices, those systems the volumes that are traded is not appropriate. So what is the alternative? There are many alternatives, and they go from small farmers should consider retail. They should never, they shouldn't consider delivering to fresh produce markets because the prices there are too low because they are bulk markets. So in a sense, farmers must develop a retail presence. With your production, you need to move away from a dependence on chemicals, and you need to start harvesting biological wastes because they are available and they are also productive. Sure, they are organic and sustainable, but you should choose them because they are productive. And the judicious processing of those things at very, very sophisticated levels with fermentation and microorganisms presents us with an alternative. So basically what I say is your production has to be the convergence of multiple technologies. And these are a deep trench, which is highly fertile and cheap, with mulch, with a small irrigation system. Put all of that in a tunnel. Have your companion planting. Use your pollination. Use your liquid manure. Do those things. Stack them on top of each other. Maximum productivity on minimum space. Then it becomes viable. At Izindaba Zokudla, farmers would stand up and say, if you don't farm in a deep trench, then you might as well stop farming because your yields will not be high enough to make it worthwhile. So we often farmers just farm because we give them money or we form a co-op and they farm, but actually everyone loses. The other thing that I realized is in these urban areas, if you are now metabolizing biological waste in a deep trench for your production, why not harvest that waste from the customer? Give a 30% discount, and then your cost of the waste that you pay to the customer or the discount is on par with the open market price of compost. So you don't lose. Plus, you win the opportunity cost, plus the customer benefits, and now you're offering higher value to the customer. It can be that people will exclusively feed themselves by collecting waste and exchanging that with the farmer. And this can only be done at small scale in an urban area. It's unfeasible to see this happening anywhere else. So, and now you are getting in inputs for next season's production. So next season will be better. So why do we not do this? Why are we not creative in our imaginations? Put together all this stuff from permaculture and organic and from commercial and from Jadam and from Andrew Milson and from LEISA, Low External Input Agriculture. Why don't we put these things together? I mean, we are agricultural experts, but we don't do that. Hi, Kona. So I just said, no, enough is enough. Basta. I'm going to do that. Let's put all this together. It's there already. It's already coherent. Let's just keep it together.
But why do you think that this is only applicable in your urbanized spaces? Why would it not work in other contexts? I think about your rural spaces where there are a lot of cooperatives and they work on shared grounds. They've got common age plots, whatever the term is. Why would it not work in that context? I do see it working in your rural spaces also.
Now, there are two parts of my answer. So the one part is, sure, they can work. And I mean, this is agriculture. Agriculture is business, and any innovation must be tested. So there's no such thing as one thing only working in urban or rural, or there is no such thing, because it's an enterprise and you are constantly seeking innovation, anything can work. It just depends upon how you implement. So that's the one answer. So especially small farmers in rural areas with access to biological wastes, like residue from crops or whatever, cow manure, yes, can work fantastic. So do it, go for it. The only thing is, what is for me part of the bigger picture, and that's why it's urban, is your proximity to the market. So if your customer is just outside the border of your farm, it's a little bit of a different proposition than if the customer is 2 kilometers away in the township. So there's just something which is the normal business feature, of location, location, location. So cool. Anything can be taken. Cool. But my second part of the answer is to do with co-ops and the institutional complexity of managing them. I'm saying, and you can take me up, I'm saying co-ops fail, they also fail because everyone is farming in the wrong way. And therefore, because they are exposed to commercial farming, my guess is they are using half or less of the recommended fertilizers. And that's why the crops are so low. And that's why the co-op fails. That's a very clear material reason. And they don't use enough fertilizer because they don't have the capital. So for those kind of guys, you need to take responsibility for your own development. It is not the government or cooperative or development agency. It's not their responsibility to make you succeed. If you are not able to buy enough fertilizers, then you must go and find something else that will work. And that could be dead dogs that you get from the road, could be chicken manure, it could be cow manure, it could be a mix of that. You could start your own Sue Johnson bioreactor. You can make your own compost extracts, but it is your responsibility to do that. So now my answer, the institutional complexity. Most co-ops in South Africa are not co-ops. You are only a co-op if there's something that you own communally. And all things being equal, if you are a co-op, you should outperform a non-co-op, because a co-op of 5 people with only 4 sewing machines should use the 4 sewing machines as a private company with 5 people and 5 sewing machines. So the co-op should beat the private company because they bought 4 and not 5 sewing machines. So the savings on the one, the less capital expenditure, everything else being equal, they should beat the private company. But they don't. Why? Because they don't have anything in common. So there's no communalism, there's no savings on that, there's no motivation based on less capex for higher productivity. It's not there. And often the land is not even theirs. It's just a piece of land that the chief gave them. So it's no communal ownership either. So it's not a co-op. So what you have is a bunch of people like potatoes in a sack, and they are not actually able then to use the communal shared ownership as an advantage. So we set them up to fail.
I get your argument. I wish I could actually speak against what you're saying. I used to work as a cooperative development officer back when I started my career. I was with the Department of Rural Development and Land Reform at the time. And we used to work with cooperatives. Interestingly, we had agricultural and non-agricultural cooperatives. None of them were doing as well as we had hoped they would. So what the department did was to support them in terms of inputs and equipment for those that were sowing. Others were baking even. But there was a lot of bureaucracy also in that. And there was just no success. But with particular focus on the agricultural one, people were very much demotivated because they felt they didn't have a sense of ownership because, as you are correctly stating, they were using land that were given to them by the tribal authorities, and they did not have control of how the land was managed. And they were only given the piece of land for so long. So that meant that even if there were opportunities of putting up some infrastructure, they would not consider that because it's going to be taken away at the end of the day. I suppose that's one thing actually that needs to be spoken about in many roundtables, especially in the policy-making spaces. But it's people like yourself that need to actually drive these conversations. And I hope that you are going to continue driving these even outside izindaba zokudla. But uh, I I also want to tie my next question on the concept that you mention in the book, the food for waste concept, food for waste exchange concept. And I was particularly taken when you mentioned that actually, you know what, we need to start rewarding people. We can actually take this approach and reward people. They collect waste, they bring it to us as urban farmers. Then we reward people, give them a discount or something. That's what you said. And you made me think of the time I visited Oranjezicht City Farm in Cape Town. So they get community members to actually bring bokashi to them. But in exchange, they would give them free vegetables. Or if they want more, they would give them a discount. So can you expand for me on the food for waste exchange concept, please?
You know, I've never been to Oranjezicht, but I know my good friend Tim Abba, they fly him down from Joburg to teach there.
Oh,
But
lovely.
yeah, it's a very privileged and affluent garden. And sure, these people can bring their bokashi. And, I know bokashi is a really nice, very nice word. Yes, I know it's beautiful, but it adds an extra layer of complexity and cost to the composting of food waste. You would do much better just chucking soil on it. Anyway, let's get that out of the way. So sure, people can bring it. And maybe for the Oranjezicht, that's fine. But if it's a middle class, affluent people and they feel very bad about their food waste because we generate a lot, thank you for doing that. But that is for me not realistic in the context of poverty. Where people, where it would be a little bit of effort to bring the waste to the farm, etc. Why not reward them? And if you reward them, now we're not depending on charity. Next week, all the whiteys are now tired and they didn't bring their food waste. Now everything fails. No. Cannot rely on charity. You've got to create a real incentive so this thing works permanently, durably over time. So to give R5 discount, and it took me a couple of days to work this out, to give a R5 discount on a 20-liter paint bucket of biological waste is about the same cost as if you buy the compost on the open market. The kitchen waste might give a little bit better compost, but it's basically the same stuff. So you are not losing, and the farmer is gaining the opportunity cost of going to find and purchase the stuff. So that's important. But also then, as you sell, your inputs come in. And this is a business strategy to guarantee inputs and productivity in the next season. So this is how I thought. You see, I'm thinking about this as an enterprise development problem and not a food waste problem. See, I want to take the food waste, transform it into something that can give benefit to people. I cannot, the Oranjezicht model won't work in a poor area. It just wouldn't. There are other reasons that would make it work, and we need to explore those. So this sounds all very fine, but I introduced this and I had the opportunity with Izindaba Zokudla. So for over a period of a year, I workshopped it and how you set it up, how it should look like, photos and everything, and farmers are doing that. What happened is people took the idea, implemented it, and went beyond it. One day I went to Soweto. Actually, I went to Orange Farm, and there at the farm, Tim Abba's farm, there was 1,000 liters of urine, human urine, which was exchanged for food. And that urine is then processed into a liquid fertilizer, which sells for 100 Rand a liter. And there's a queue of people who buy it. On the one day, we sold 900 liters. My bakkie couldn't move. We loaded it up too much. We sold the 900 liters on the one day.
That's 90,000 rands.
Yeah.
Is it 90,000 or 9,000?
It was a huge order. I mean, so they sell in drips and drabs, and people pay 100 Rand a liter, not because government says so, but because if they pay the 100 Rand a liter and they use that on their own crops, they produce more that offsets the 100 Rand, and they produce 150 Rand. This is how we must think about it. This is how, so if you're an urban farmer and you have this product, it's not just this product for charity. That product must create value for the person that you sell it to. And if it indeed does, then we're all moving forward. That's how we should think about it. It's only, and I'm not a capitalist or anything like that. I mean, I know these things, but come on, guys, we need level-headed thinking here, because we are losing people, we are losing lives, and we can't fight this on ideological grounds. Whatever we say must work, and all of the things I wrote in the book have been implemented by farmers in Soweto, and I've traveled and looked at these things. Not always so well, but yeah, it's there.
Yeah. So I suppose I think that's a fascinating innovation, actually, to use human urine. I would never have thought of that. In fact, I know most people would actually frown. They would say, "You're feeding us urine." So I'm very
I donate voluntarily.
I'm very much interested in knowing what the actual process of refining that is, so that it is not smelly and potent. I'm not even sure if urine is potent.
Yes. So what happens, I mean, it is a bit of a sift thing, but so if you let it stand for 48 hours, then it becomes a base, alkaline, which is very important because all our soils are acidic in South Africa. So if you let it stand for, the mosquitoes also go in there, so it's very dirty. So you let it stand, and then basically you chuck it in your skip, your municipal rubbish bin, fill it with rabbit urine and human urine, add some water to stretch it. You can stretch it 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 times, and you add mostly rabbit manure into that. So what happens is the bacteria in the manure start metabolizing any pesticide, pathogens, heavy metals and stuff in the urine. I mean, these things are all biological, and over time they all become clean. It's really, really very low risk, except if you eat the stuff. But you basically mix it and you bottle it. So the one farmer, he pays the kids at the school 50 cents per empty 2-liter Coke bottle. And he pays someone 3 Rand for a label, which he has designed. And then so it costs him about 3 Rand, 4 Rand, let's say 5 Rand per liter production cost. And then he sells 100. It used to be 50 Rand, and I think the price has now also gone up. The prices go up because it's a business, and there's benefit, because if you buy it, you will yourself have that benefit. So that's it. The one day while we were filling it, the one bottle exploded.
Oh, shucks.
And so covered with this stuff. But it's got a bit of a smell, and it's pretty good for you.
I mean, every organic manure has a smell.
Yeah, it's it's good for you. The bacteria, your gut health, your skin health. We are animals. We need to note this. Yeah.
Of course, I would love to make 9,000 rands a day from urine only. I mean that.
As soon as this farmer gets land, as soon as he gets a farm, touch wood. As soon as he gets a farm, I'm not going to help him. I'm going to invest my own money in this business. I'm telling you.
I thought you said you're going to invest your own urine.
That as well.
So I'm just thinking, if I were to take this idea to a rural community, what the reaction would actually be from people. They would probably say, meaning that people are actually practicing witchcraft. What is this?
Yeah, but look at this point now. So now this is happening in Soweto. Meanwhile, whitey like me, I sit at home. What do? I look at the internet. Here I find Jay Young from Young Red Angus in America using the Sue Johnson bioreactor to extract compost extracts, which is basically the same stuff that these guys are making in Soweto. And so Jay Young is extracting this stuff and selling it on the open market, as a product. that is tested and validated with labels and everything. So like I look at this and I look at, the farmers in Soweto, and I look again at the YouTube and I'm thinking, hi, Kona, but this is a super solution for a community in a rural area. And it can cost you nothing. With just a bit of ingenuity. You can take a tire, with a pipe from the tire, and it blows into the container with your extract. Now you turn it into aerobic digestion. Bwah! 1 hour later, you've got a liquid manure that you can add to your maize field, maize and soya, and it's effective.
I suppose what would also be important is to actually have this tested and to know the concentration of the urine, water, and rabbit waste that needs to go in there. Because I suppose the fear would be we don't want to find ourselves harming the microorganisms in the soil in any way, because we'd also be shooting ourselves in the foot if we over apply certain things. And also the application measure is very important, I would argue. I suppose those are things that still need to be ironed out on this innovation.
Sorry, if I could just interrupt you in that point. We must realize that with biological processes, your risks are much, much lower. Because, I would take a bet that if you analyze that liquid manure over time, it becomes more or less exactly the same as good soil. See, all these biological processes converge to your anaerobically fertile soil, or your aerobic or anaerobic and anaerobically. That's like the sweet spot that all migrate to, and that is the outcome of biological processes. So there's low risk.
I'm not disputing that, but we do have risk-averse people that would want to adopt this, but they work on calculations and they want to be sure that actually I'm not setting myself up for failure here. I think it's a brilliant idea. I am very much looking forward to learning more about it, actually. and I mean, I just started vermicomposting in my own space in the garden that my students practice in, and it's just phenomenal. But I also wanted to then find out, because you spoke about kitchen waste. What does this kitchen waste look like? Because I would not think that things like chicken skin have to go into that waste, right? So for a person who is listening and watching and wants to take this kitchen waste concept, what does it look like?
No, it's all the kitchen waste. Bones, fats. The doctor said I mustn't eat so much fat, and that's yammer. But all of that goes in there. Everything that was alive. The one farmer in Soweto, his Rottweiler died. He buried the Rottweiler in the deep trench, and you must see how green the maize is now. So we must note this. All of these things are part of the circle of life. We all watch The Lion King. It's the circle of life. So what you do, the danger is, in the beginning stages of the composting process, the food is attractive to vermin and rats. So that is the solution. So that is the problem, but also the solution. So that is very easy to solve. I mean, your bokashi would solve that. If you I just put my kitchen waste in a bucket, add soil and water so it ferments quickly. And once it's past the rancid stage, when it's starting to get rotten, then the rats are not interested. Then it goes to the compost heap. So there are always ways to do it. For a while, I chucked it into water. So the water becomes this stinky water, which was a really good soil conditioner. So there are things like that happens. And also, if you understand how to make your liquid manures, your brown that kills everything and conditions the soil, your green for nitrogen, your animal bones for calcium, your overripe fruits and chicken for phosphates and phosphorus. If you understand those liquid manures, plus fish bones, cattle bones or scop you can ferment, once you understand those, you can substitute or you can add them at the growth stage of the plant. Now, they are broad-based. They're not specific like the chemicals. I mean, the guys who grow marijuana indoor, they will know. But this can approximate it. Also, what you do is, on your previous point, you never add it to the rows themselves. You always add it in between the rows and you cover it in the soil. So there are ways in which you use it. And it was actually Mr. McCloy, one of the farmers, he once took me on a tour of his farm where he had all these manures fermenting next to the field. And I realized this is the way to go. Yeah. Yeah. So that was not my idea. It was a farmer's idea.
That's very lovely. So I always encourage my students to put back to the soil what they take from the soil. But the idea of using things like your chicken skin and whatnot on the soil has actually never crossed my mind. But then I suppose it does make sense in the context of, you speak about a friend that uses a Rottweiler on his farm. The decomposition process takes place there, and then it nourishes the soil. I suppose in that context that does work. But how long does the decomposition process take place? If I were to start culling my animals, I hope people don't do that. If I was to start culling my animals or collecting remains of dead animals, and said, I actually want to start a farming enterprise and I want to use Nadia's approach, how long would that take me before I start planting?
What you do is with these liquid manures, you always dilute them. Remember? So about 1 to 100, round about there, 1 to 50. The only one that you don't have to dilute is your compost tea, which you can apply straight. And that's very, very good. But what these things do is they carry very little nutrients. But what they carry is the bacteria. Like, for instance, if you ferment bones, then the bacteria that can naturally metabolize calcium, they start dominating that mixture. So when you add that mixture to the soil, then you're adding the bacteria that can release calcium from the soil that's already there. And that is how it works. So they don't bring nutrients, but the worst mine sand from a mine dump in Soweto, that mine dump has all the nutrients a plant needs, but it's not bioavailable. So what you're doing is that you're just making it bioavailable because you're adding the right nutrients. And that's the theory. And that came from Alan Rosenberg's work on permaculture. And he worked that out very well. Yeah. And thank you, Alan. So that's the game. Yeah, that's the game. And then if you add that to a deep trench where there's lots of biological material already, because you deposit the stuff in the deep trench. Now you're adding all these bacteria in a liquid form. Now, all of a sudden, very quickly, the fermentation processes start. And now it releases those nutrients. Yeah. And now it's looking good. Yeah.
Nadia, are you saying that in urban spaces we should consider moving away from individualized type of farming to more of a collective approach, work together as a community? Am I hearing you correctly?
No, I'll go the other way. You need an entrepreneur to manage the enterprise. Yeah. So I would recommend only individuals. Yeah. So
okay. Reason why I asked that.
Yeah. And rather let others farm, because if we have a system that can create enough productivity, let's say on 5 meters by 5 meters, keep it there.
Okay. Yeah. The reason why I asked that is because I'm thinking about the issue of space. I'm looking at Soweto in my head. And I know that most of the times when we talk about farming in your urbanized spaces, one of the greatest challenges is space. So how does then one navigate around that? And in your experience, having worked with these communities, if this were to be replicated in most townships, considering the space constraint. How would people navigate that?
Mm. No, it's weird. Like last week, one of the farmers I mentor, we went to a farm. The title deed is agriculture. It's a 14-hectare farm in Soweto. The farm is 40 meters wide and 2 kilometers long. And it's a farm with a stream. So there
Yeah,
is
that's big.
land. Yeah, there's a lot of land. If you talk to town planners, they talk about the pieces of land that are cut off at the end of the portions. So there is land available. There's often land at schools, and I've found if the farmer is able, the schools want able farmers because it benefits the school dramatically. So, for instance, CEO Isile is only on half a hectare, and you can go there. CEO Isile in Dlala in Protea Glen. I mean, all the technologies I talk about in the book is on this farm, and they're
Mm.
doing quite all right. It is possible to get the land. I think the bigger issue is to have a proper lease contract. So what you
Okay.
want is you want a 99-year lease that is transferable, so you can sell the farm, and you want to also protect any infrastructure you build on the farm. But
Mm.
so now it becomes real. It's not now a hanky panky stuff. Now it's real. It's a real contract that has to be formed, and we must make this real and hard. So we are serious about this. Yeah.
Mm.
So
Mm.
yeah. I mean, the way to go is a lease contract. Yeah. Mm.
Okay. No, Nadia, like I said when we first started, I've got a lot of questions for you, but I do see behind me the clock is saying
Yeah.
actually you need to cut now. But I will say this. I will put a pause. This is not the last time I'm seeing you, hopefully,
Mm.
because I would still want to engage more. This is a very practical approach to farming, to actually transforming people's livelihoods in general, especially in the less explored spaces in the context of agriculture, which would be your urbanized spaces. I think the focus is usually on your rural farmers and your commercial farmers, but nobody looks much into your urban spaces. And this is why I find this particularly interesting. But it goes beyond theory, it is very pragmatic, if you may. And I think it's actually a right way to approach this agriculture question, food sustainability, and also it addresses other issues. Unemployment is one of the things that you talk about in the book, and considering the triple threat challenge, I think it responds to those pressing issues. So for that, I'd like to say thank you very much. But I do have a last question for you. If you look ahead, what's your ultimate vision for urban agriculture in South Africa?
You know what? What I would like to do, is work on the second edition to make it, really well. If I had the opportunity, I would, quit my job, and I'm now working for a company called HER Research and Development. I would, if it was an ideal world, I'll quit my job and I'll travel from township to township to promote not the book but urban agriculture.
Mm.
I will be even prepared to camp every night in my tent to do that. So that's a bit of
Wow.
an idealist thing, but that I think is necessary. The Stats SA reckons there are 3.2 million backyard farmers in South Africa. It's our
Yes.
biggest constituency of farmers, and
I
those are
I
our
still do
people.
think that number. I still do think that that number is not realistic. I think it's more than that, actually.
Could be. That could be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How do people get access to this book? Is it sold somewhere? Is it freely available somewhere?
Yeah.
I think that's the interesting part.
Yeah. No, there's a free download. So I'm very happy about that. Just guys, remember every time you download, I actually did pay for it. So these,
Okay.
when you write a book these days, the author pays. It's not like it was in the old days. And I'm very happy to do that. And thank you for the ARC for the money that paid me, because that's what financed it. But so it's a free download, and I would encourage everyone to overload the server. That's fine. But there will be a hard copy that UJ Press will make available, and it will be sold on all the major online, Amazon and all of those. And the price is about 330 Rand. Yeah. So
Okay.
that's it's going to be available in the next few weeks.
For the benefit of those that are watching and listening, I will insert a link in the description below. And please do download, please read the book, use it for your own benefit. And when the hard copy is available, there's nothing as amazing as grabbing that book and actually smelling those pages when the book is super fresh and feasting on it. Please do ensure that you do purchase that book. I pre-ordered myself. Nadia, I hope I'm gonna get my copy soon. And with that said, I'd like to thank you for your time. I think this has been a wonderful conversation. I look forward to having you in the next season here on BTH. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Phambili Balimi. Thank you to all the farmers. Thank you so much.